Chapter 1. You don't wake up one day and decide to be depressed. It doesn't announce itself clearly. It creeps in quietly, reshaping your thoughts, draining your energy, and distorting your sense of reality until even simple things start to feel heavy. At some point, you stop recognizing yourself. What used to feel easy now feels exhausting. What used to bring joy feels empty. And the worst part is not the sadness. It's the numbness, the silence inside your own mind. If you are here, listening to this, you are likely not okay. And I won't insult you with empty positivity. Depression is not solved by thinking happy thoughts. It is not weakness, and it is not laziness. It is a complex interaction of biology, environment, cognition, and behavior. And recovery is not instant. It is systematic. But here is the truth you need to hear early. Recovery is possible. Not guaranteed, not automatic, but absolutely possible, if you approach it correctly. The first mistake most people make is waiting to feel better before they act. That is backwards. When you are depressed, your feelings are unreliable indicators of what you should do. If you wait for motivation, you will stay stuck. Action must come first. Feeling follows behavior, not the other way around. Right now, your brain is operating in a biased state. It selectively filters negative information, exaggerates failures, and minimizes anything positive. This is not your personality. This is a cognitive distortion pattern driven by neurochemical imbalance and reinforced by habit loops. If you don't challenge it, it becomes your default mode. So the first step is not to fix everything. The first step is to stop trusting every thought you have. Your mind will tell you that nothing will change, that you've already tried, that it's pointless, that you are different from others who recover. These thoughts feel convincing because they are repeated, not because they are true. You need to start treating your thoughts as hypotheses, not facts. That shift alone creates distance, and distance creates control. Now understand this clearly. Depression thrives on inactivity. The less you do, the worse you feel. The worse you feel, the less you do. This is a closed loop. Breaking this loop requires deliberate, uncomfortable action. Not big action, not dramatic life changes. Small, controlled, repeatable behaviors. If you cannot manage your whole day, manage the next hour. If you cannot manage the hour, manage the next 10 minutes. Depression wants you to think in extremes. Recovery happens in increments. There is also something else you need to confront honestly. Many people unknowingly reinforce their own depression. They isolate themselves, disrupt their sleep cycles, avoid responsibilities, and consume content that deepens their negativity. Then they expect their mental state to improve without changing inputs. That is not how the brain works. Your brain adapts to patterns. If you feed it chaos, it becomes chaotic. If you feed it structure, it stabilizes. You don't need perfection. You need consistency. At this stage, your goal is stabilization, not transformation. You are not trying to become the best version of yourself yet. You are trying to become functional again. That means focusing on 3 core systems: sleep, movement, and exposure. Sleep is not optional. Irregular sleep amplifies emotional instability and cognitive distortion. If your sleep is broken, your recovery will be slow. Start by fixing your wake-up time, not your sleep time. Wake up at the same time every day, even if you slept poorly. Your body will adjust. Movement is non-negotiable. You don't need intense workouts. A simple 20-minute walk daily is enough to begin shifting your neurochemistry. Physical movement directly influences mood-regulating neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. This is biology, not motivation. Exposure means facing life, even when you don't feel like it. Depression pushes you to withdraw. You must do the opposite, deliberately. Talk to people, go outside, engage in small activities. Not because you enjoy them, but because they prevent your world from shrinking further. You will not feel like doing any of this. That is expected. If you wait for willingness, you lose. You act first. Feeling comes later. Another critical point: stop comparing your internal state to other people's external presentation. You are measuring your worst moments against their highlight reel. That comparison is flawed and destructive. Your process is individual. Focus on trajectory, not speed. Now, let's address something deeper. Many people with depression carry unresolved emotional weight loss, failure, regret, guilt, or trauma. These don't disappear by ignoring them. But trying to process everything at once will overwhelm you. You need containment. That means giving your emotions a controlled space instead of letting them leak into everything. One effective method is structured reflection. Set aside 10 to 15 minutes daily to write or think intentionally about what is bothering you. Outside of that time, when intrusive thoughts arise, you postpone them. This trains your brain that emotions are handled deliberately, not constantly. This is how you regain control over mental noise. At this point, don't expect clarity. Expect resistance. Your brain will push back against every change. That's not failure. That's adaptation. You are rewiring patterns that have been reinforced over time. That takes repetition. One more thing that needs to be said bluntly: you are not as stuck as you think you are. Your perception of permanence is part of the disorder. Depression convinces you that your current state is permanent. It is not. But you have to prove that wrong through action, not belief. Right now, your job is simple, not easy. Wake up at a fixed time. Move your body daily. Expose yourself to life, even in small ways. Limit isolation. Create structure where there is none. And most importantly, stop obeying every thought your mind produces. You are not trying to win the whole battle today. You are trying to take control of the next decision. That is how recovery begins. Not with a breakthrough. With discipline. Chapter 2. Anxiety is not separate from depression. In most cases, it is tightly interlinked, feeding into the same dysfunctional system. If depression is the weight that holds you down, anxiety is the force that keeps your mind in constant agitation. One drains your energy, the other consumes it. Together, they create a state where you feel both exhausted and restless at the same time. You need to understand anxiety properly, because most people deal with it incorrectly. They try to eliminate it. That approach fails almost every time. Anxiety is not something you delete. It is something you regulate and retrain. At its core, anxiety is a prediction system. Your brain is constantly trying to anticipate threats. When functioning normally, this system is useful. It keeps you alert, prepared, and responsive. But when it becomes dysregulated, it starts identifying threats where none exist, exaggerating risks, and creating worst-case scenarios that feel real. The critical problem is not the presence of anxious thoughts. The problem is your response to them. Most people react to anxiety in one of three ways. They either avoid the trigger, try to suppress the thought, or overanalyze it. All three responses reinforce anxiety over time. Avoidance teaches your brain that the situation is dangerous, so it increases fear the next time. Suppression makes the thought rebound stronger, because the brain treats it as something important. Overanalysis traps you in a loop where you try to think your way out of something that is not solved by thinking. So if these don't work, what does? You need to shift from reaction to observation. When an anxious thought appears, instead of engaging with it immediately, you step back and label it, not emotionally, but clinically. You identify it as a mental event, not a reality. For example, instead of thinking something is going to go wrong, you reframe it as, I am having the thought that something might go wrong. That small shift creates psychological distance. It weakens the automatic authority of the thought. This is not positive thinking. It is accurate thinking. Your brain generates thousands of thoughts daily. Most of them are irrelevant or distorted. Treating all of them as meaningful is a fundamental error. Now, let's go deeper into intrusive thoughts, because this is where many people struggle. Intrusive thoughts are unwanted, repetitive, and often disturbing ideas that enter your mind without permission. They can be about failure, harm, embarrassment, or loss of control. The content varies, but the mechanism is consistent. The more you try to push these thoughts away, the stronger they become. This is known as the rebound effect. The brain interprets suppression as importance. If you are trying so hard not to think something, it assumes that thought must matter. So it keeps bringing it back. The correct response is counterintuitive. You allow the thought to exist without reacting to it. This does not mean you agree with it. It means you stop fighting it. Think of your mind as a stream. Thoughts pass through constantly. When you try to block the stream, pressure builds. When you let it flow, the intensity decreases over time. But here is where most people fail. They say they are allowing the thought, but internally they are still resisting it. That contradiction keeps the cycle active. True acceptance means you let the thought be there without trying to change it, analyze it, or get rid of it. It will feel uncomfortable. That discomfort is part of the process. Over time, your brain learns that the thought is not a threat, and its intensity reduces. Now let's address a major misconception. People believe that if they do not engage with anxious thoughts, something bad might happen because they were not prepared. This is a cognitive distortion. It overestimates the importance of worry. Worry does not prevent problems. It only creates mental exhaustion. Preparation is useful. Worry is repetitive and unproductive. You need to differentiate between the two. If a thought leads to a concrete action, it is useful. If it loops without resolution, it is not. For example, planning your work schedule is productive. Replaying the same fear about failure without taking action is not. Your goal is to cut off unproductive loops. One effective method is setting boundaries for thinking. This may sound unusual, but it is necessary. You allocate a specific time for problem solving and reflection. Outside of that time, when your brain tries to pull you into worry, you redirect your attention. This is not avoidance. This is controlled engagement. You are training your mind to operate on your terms, not on automatic impulses. Now let's talk about the body, because anxiety is not just mental, it is physiological. When you are anxious, your nervous system shifts into a heightened state. Your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes shallow, and your muscles tense up. This is the fight or flight response. The problem is not the response itself. The problem is that it stays activated for too long. You cannot think your way out of a physiological state. You need to regulate it through the body. Controlled breathing is one of the most effective tools here, but only if done correctly. Slow, deep breathing signals to your nervous system that there is no immediate threat. It activates the parasympathetic system, which reduces arousal. A simple method is to inhale slowly for 4 seconds, hold briefly, and exhale for 6 seconds. The longer exhale is critical because it promotes relaxation. You do not do this once and expect results. You repeat it consistently, especially when anxiety rises. Another important factor is muscle tension. Many people remain physically tense without realizing it. This keeps the body in a state of alertness. You need to deliberately release that tension. Progressive muscle relaxation is one method. You systematically tense and release different muscle groups, teaching your body the difference between tension and relaxation. Again, this is not about instant relief. It is about retraining your baseline state. Now, let's address a hard truth. Many people unintentionally maintain their anxiety because it gives them a false sense of control. Worrying feels like you are doing something about a problem. It creates an illusion of preparedness. But in reality, it keeps you stuck. If you want to reduce anxiety, you have to tolerate uncertainty. There is no way around this. You cannot eliminate all risks, predict all outcomes, or control every variable. Trying to do so will exhaust you. Instead, you build tolerance for not knowing. This is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Start small. Allow minor uncertainties without trying to resolve them immediately. Let things remain incomplete. Over time, your tolerance increases. This is how you reduce the need for constant mental control. Now connect this back to depression. When anxiety is high, it drains your cognitive and emotional resources. This contributes to fatigue, hopelessness, and withdrawal. So if you reduce anxiety, you indirectly reduce depressive symptoms. These systems are interconnected. You cannot treat one in isolation. There is another layer you need to understand. Your environment plays a significant role in maintaining anxiety. Constant exposure to negative information, chaotic routines, and lack of structure all amplify mental instability. You need to audit your inputs. What you consume matters. If you are constantly engaging with content that increases fear, comparison, or negativity, you are reinforcing your mental state. This includes social media, news, and even conversations. You do not need to isolate yourself from the world, but you need to be selective. Reduce noise, increase clarity. Now, let's talk about control, because this is where many people get stuck. You are trying to control thoughts, emotions, and outcomes simultaneously. That is not possible. You need to separate what is controllable from what is not. You can control your actions. You can influence your thoughts. You cannot directly control your emotions. This distinction is critical. When you try to control emotions directly, you fail and become frustrated. When you focus on actions, emotions shift as a byproduct. So instead of asking, "How do I stop feeling anxious?" you ask, "What action can I take despite feeling anxious?" That is a more effective question. Action reduces uncertainty. It creates feedback. It moves you forward. Even small actions matter. Now let's address the fear of relapse. Many people worry that even if they improve, they will fall back into the same state. This fear can prevent progress. You need to understand that recovery is not linear. There will be fluctuations. A bad day does not mean you are back at the beginning. The difference between relapse and temporary setback is your response. If you treat a bad day as failure, you reinforce the pattern. If you treat it as part of the process, you maintain momentum. Consistency matters more than perfection. At this stage, your focus is not eliminating anxiety completely. That is unrealistic. Your focus is reducing its intensity, shortening its duration, and improving your response to it. That is measurable progress. You need to track that, not just how you feel in the moment. Finally, understand this. Anxiety loses power when you stop organizing your life around avoiding it. If you keep making decisions based on fear, your world shrinks. Your confidence decreases. Your dependence on avoidance increases. If you start making decisions based on values and long-term goals, even while anxious, your world expands. That is how you rebuild your life. not by waiting for anxiety to disappear, but by moving forward with it until it no longer controls you. They treat it as purely emotional or chemical, which leads them to wait for internal change before taking external action. That approach fails. Your internal state is heavily influenced by your behavior patterns. If your actions are disorganized, inconsistent, and driven by avoidance, your mental state will follow that structure. This is where behavioral activation comes in, not as a vague concept, but as a structured intervention. It is one of the most evidence-based methods for treating depression, and it works for a simple reason. It targets the system that depression disrupts the most, your ability to act. When you are depressed, your brain reduces initiation. Tasks feel heavier, decisions feel harder, and even basic actions require disproportionate effort. Over time, you start doing less. That reduction in activity leads to fewer rewarding experiences, less sense of progress, and more time spent in passive thinking. That is the downward spiral. Behavioral activation reverses this process, not by waiting for motivation, but by creating a system where action happens regardless of how you feel. You need to understand something clearly. Motivation is unreliable. It fluctuates, disappears, and often shows up after you start something, not before. Discipline, on the other hand, is built through structure. If you rely on motivation, you will remain inconsistent. If you rely on structure, you can function even when motivation is absent. So the question is not, how do I feel like doing things? The question is, how do I design my environment and routine so that doing things becomes automatic? Start with your current baseline. Most people make the mistake of setting unrealistic expectations. They go from doing almost nothing to planning an ideal day filled with productivity, exercise, social interaction, and self-improvement. That plan collapses within days because it does not match their current capacity. You need to calibrate your starting point accurately. If you are currently struggling to get out of bed consistently, your first target is not a full morning routine. Your first target is simply getting up at a fixed time and staying out of bed. That is it. It sounds basic, but it is not trivial. It establishes control over your day. Once that becomes consistent, you add the next layer. This is how you build momentum. Behavioral activation works through gradual expansion. You start small, stabilize, and then increase complexity. Now let's talk about task design, because vague goals do not work. Saying, "I will be productive today," is meaningless. Your brain cannot act on that. You need specific, actionable tasks with clear boundaries. Instead of study, you define review one topic for 20 minutes. Instead of exercise, you define walk for 15 minutes. Specificity reduces resistance. Another critical factor is task size. When a task feels too large, your brain avoids it. This is not laziness. It is cognitive overload. You need to break tasks into units that are small enough to start without hesitation. If something feels overwhelming, it is too big. Reduce it until it becomes manageable. This is where many people sabotage themselves. They think small tasks are insignificant. They are wrong. Small tasks are the building blocks of consistency. Consistency is what drives recovery. Now address the issue of energy. You will not feel energetic at the start. Waiting for energy is another trap. Action generates energy, not the other way around. When you start moving, even in small ways, your brain begins to shift. This is tied to dopamine regulation. Completing tasks, even minor ones, creates a sense of progress. That reinforces further action. You are essentially retraining your reward system. But here is where you need to be precise. The goal is not just to complete tasks. The goal is to complete tasks that have value. There are 3 categories you need to focus on: maintenance, growth, and exposure. Maintenance tasks keep your life stable. These include basic hygiene, eating properly, cleaning your space, and managing responsibilities. When these are neglected, your environment becomes chaotic, which reinforces mental instability. Growth tasks improve your skills, knowledge, or future opportunities. This could be studying, learning something new, or working on your career. Exposure tasks involve engaging with situations you tend to avoid, such as social interaction or leaving your comfort zone. Your routine should include elements from all 3 categories. If you only focus on maintenance, you survive but do not progress. If you only focus on growth, you may neglect basic stability. If you avoid exposure, your world shrinks. Balance is necessary. Now let's talk about habit formation, because this is where discipline becomes sustainable. Habits are not built through intensity. They are built through repetition in stable contexts. You need to anchor new behaviors to existing ones. This is called habit stacking. For example, if you already brush your teeth every morning, you attach a new behavior immediately after it, such as a short walk or a few minutes of planning your day. This reduces the need for decision-making. The behavior becomes part of a sequence. Decision fatigue is a major issue in depression. The more decisions you have to make, the more likely you are to avoid action. By creating routines, you reduce the number of decisions required. Now address your environment. Your surroundings either support your behavior or undermine it. If your environment is disorganized, filled with distractions, and lacks structure, it will be harder to maintain discipline. You need to simplify it. Remove unnecessary distractions. Keep your workspace clear. Make the actions you want to take easier to access. For example, if you want to read, keep the book visible. If you want to exercise, keep your shoes ready. This may seem minor, but it reduces friction. Behavior is heavily influenced by convenience. Now let's address a common failure point: inconsistency. You will not execute perfectly every day. That is not the goal. The goal is to minimize gaps. Missing one day is not a problem. Missing multiple days creates a pattern. You need a rule: never miss twice. If you fail to complete your tasks one day, you reset immediately the next day. No delay, no overthinking. This prevents small failures from becoming long-term setbacks. Another issue is overloading your schedule. When you try to do too much, you increase the likelihood of failure. When you fail repeatedly, your confidence decreases. This creates a negative feedback loop. You need to operate slightly below your maximum capacity, not at it. This allows consistency. Now let's talk about tracking, because what gets measured gets managed. You need a simple system to track your actions, not your feelings, your actions. At the end of the day, you evaluate what you did, not how you felt. Did you wake up at the planned time? Did you complete your tasks? Did you move your body? Did you engage with life? This creates objective feedback. Your mood may fluctuate, but your actions provide data. Over time, you will see patterns. You will notice that on days when you act, your mental state is slightly better. Not perfect, but better. That reinforces the process. Now address the internal resistance you will face. Your mind will generate excuses. It will tell you that the task is pointless, that it will not make a difference, that you can do it later. You need to recognize these as resistance patterns, not valid arguments. Do not negotiate with them. The moment you start debating whether to act, you lose time and energy. Instead, you follow a rule: act first, evaluate later. This bypasses overthinking. Another important concept is identity. Right now, you may see yourself as someone who is unmotivated, inconsistent, or stuck. That identity influences your behavior. You need to shift your identity through action. Every time you complete a task, you reinforce a different identity. Someone who follows through, someone who acts despite difficulty. Identity is not changed by thinking differently. It is changed by behaving differently repeatedly. Now let's address reward. Your brain needs reinforcement. If you only focus on effort without any sense of reward, the system will not sustain. You need to acknowledge progress. This does not mean giving yourself excessive rewards or avoiding discipline. It means recognizing that completing tasks, even small ones, is meaningful. That recognition strengthens the behavior. Finally, understand this. Behavioral activation is not about becoming highly productive. It is about restoring function. Once function is restored, you can optimize performance. But if you skip this stage and aim directly for high performance, you will fail. Right now, your goal is simple. Act consistently. Keep tasks small and specific. Build routines that reduce decision-making. Track your behavior objectively. Do not rely on motivation. Do not wait for the right feeling. You are rebuilding a system that has been disrupted. It takes time, repetition, and precision. But if you do this correctly, you will notice something important. Your days will start to feel more structured. Your mind will have less empty space for negative loops. Your sense of control will increase. And slowly, without a dramatic moment, your baseline will shift. That is how recovery accelerates, not through sudden change, but through consistent, deliberate action repeated over time. You can structure your day, control your actions, and reduce avoidance, but there will still be something underneath that does not resolve through routine. That is the emotional layer. This is where many people either avoid completely or go too deep too fast and destabilize themselves. You need to approach emotional processing with precision. Not suppression, not uncontrolled release, but structured engagement. First, understand what you are dealing with. Emotions are not random. They are signals. They are your brain's way of processing experiences, especially those that were intense, unresolved, or repeated over time. When these experiences are not properly processed, they do not disappear. They remain active in the background, influencing your thoughts, behavior, and physiological state. This is what people often refer to as emotional baggage, but that term is vague. What you are actually dealing with are unprocessed memory networks that still carry emotional charge. These can come from different sources. Loss that was never fully accepted. Failures that were internalized as identity. Guilt that was never resolved. Chronic stress that never had a recovery period. Or trauma, which is not defined by the event itself, but by how your nervous system responded to it. If your system was overwhelmed and could not integrate the experience, it remains unresolved. Now here is the mistake most people make. They either ignore these emotions completely, or they try to confront everything at once. Both approaches fail. Ignoring emotions leads to suppression. Suppression does not eliminate emotional content. It pushes it into the background where it continues to affect you indirectly. This often shows up as irritability, numbness, anxiety, or sudden emotional reactions that seem disproportionate. On the other hand, trying to process everything at once overwhelms your system. You end up reliving emotions without resolving them, which reinforces distress. So the correct approach is controlled processing. You create a structure where emotions are engaged intentionally, in manageable amounts, with a clear boundary. This is not about venting endlessly. Venting without direction often reinforces the emotional state instead of resolving it. You need to process, not just express. Start with awareness. Most people are not actually aware of what they are feeling. They use general labels like bad, stressed, or down. These are not precise enough to work with. You need to identify specific emotions. Is it sadness, anger, guilt, shame, fear, or disappointment? Each of these has a different cause and requires a different response. For example, guilt is related to actions and can often be resolved through correction or acceptance. Shame is related to identity and requires restructuring how you see yourself. Fear is future-oriented and tied to perceived threats. Sadness is often linked to loss. If you do not differentiate, you cannot process effectively. Once you identify the emotion, the next step is to locate its source. Ask yourself a direct question. What exactly triggered this feeling? Not in a vague sense, but in a specific, situational way. If you feel anxious, what thought preceded it? If you feel low, what event or memory is connected to it? This step is critical because it connects emotion to context. Without context, emotions feel random and uncontrollable. Now, once you have identified the emotion and its source, you need to process it without escalation. This is where many people fail. They either avoid the feeling or amplify it. Avoidance blocks processing. Amplification overwhelms the system. The middle ground is controlled exposure. You allow yourself to feel the emotion, but you stay grounded. You do not dramatize it. You do not suppress it. You observe it. This requires practice. When an emotion arises, instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You focus on the physical sensations associated with it. Where do you feel it in your body? Is it tension in your chest, heaviness in your stomach, tightness in your throat? This shifts your focus from abstract thinking to direct experience. Emotions are processed through the body as much as through the mind. By staying with the physical sensation without trying to escape it, you allow the emotional response to move through its natural cycle. This cycle, if not interrupted, tends to rise, peak, and then decrease. But most people interrupt it through avoidance or overthinking. Now let's address overthinking, because this is a major barrier to emotional processing. When you experience an emotion, your mind often tries to analyze it excessively. It replays events, creates hypothetical scenarios, and generates self-criticism. This does not resolve the emotion. It prolongs it. You need to separate feeling from analysis. First, feel the emotion. Then, once the intensity decreases, you analyze it briefly and constructively. What did this emotion indicate? Is there something that needs to change? Is there an action required? If yes, define it clearly. If no, accept the emotion as a response that will pass. This prevents you from getting stuck in loops. Now, let's address trauma more directly. Trauma is not just about extreme events. It can also come from repeated smaller experiences that cumulatively overwhelm your system. The key feature of trauma is that it remains unresolved and continues to trigger responses even in safe situations. If you notice that certain reactions are disproportionate to the current situation, there is likely an underlying unresolved component. Processing trauma requires caution. You do not force yourself to relive intense experiences without preparation. That can destabilize you. Instead, you work gradually. You build emotional regulation first, which includes the skills we discussed earlier: grounding, controlled breathing, and behavioral stability. Once you have that foundation, you can start approaching deeper material in small, controlled ways. This might involve recalling an event briefly, observing the emotional response, and then returning to a stable state. The goal is not to relive the trauma fully. The goal is to reduce its emotional charge over time. If the intensity is too high, you stop and return to stabilization. This is a process, not a one-time event. Now let's address something that people avoid but is necessary: acceptance. There are some things in your past that cannot be changed. No amount of thinking, regret, or analysis will alter them. If you continue to resist this reality, you remain stuck. Acceptance does not mean you approve of what happened. It means you acknowledge that it happened and that it cannot be undone. This frees up mental energy. Without acceptance, your mind keeps returning to the same point, trying to solve something that has no solution. That loop needs to be broken. Now, let's talk about emotional suppression in daily life. Many people operate in a state where they are constantly distracting themselves to avoid feeling. They fill their time with content, work, or noise to prevent any emotional discomfort. This creates a backlog. When you finally stop, everything comes up at once, and it feels overwhelming. You need to create regular space for emotional processing so that this backlog does not build. This is where structured reflection comes in again. Set aside time daily or several times a week where you allow yourself to think and feel without distraction. But keep it contained. You are not opening everything at once. You are addressing specific elements. Now, let's address the fear of emotions. Many people are not actually afraid of the emotion itself. They are afraid of losing control. They think that if they allow themselves to feel fully, they will not be able to stop. This fear leads to suppression. But in reality, emotions are self-limiting when processed correctly. They feel intense, but they do not last indefinitely unless they are reinforced. Your job is to experience them without reinforcing them. This requires trust in the process. Finally, understand this. Emotional processing is not about becoming more emotional. It is about becoming more regulated. You are not trying to feel everything all the time. You are trying to ensure that what you feel is accurate, processed, and not carried unnecessarily. When you do this correctly, several things change. Your reactions become less intense. Your thoughts become clearer. Your past loses some of its grip on your present. And your capacity to handle future stress increases. This is not immediate. It requires repetition and control. But it is essential. Because if you only focus on behavior and ignore the emotional layer, you build a functional life on unstable ground. Eventually, unresolved emotions will surface. You need to address both. Structure your actions and process your emotions. That is how you create stable recovery. Chapter 5. At some stage, even if you improve your routine, regulate your anxiety, and process your emotions, you will still feel something is off. You will notice a pattern in how you think about yourself that does not align with the effort you are putting in. That pattern is your identity. And if you do not address it directly, it will quietly undermine everything else. Depression is not just a state you experience. Over time, it becomes a lens through which you interpret yourself. You stop seeing it as something you have, and you start seeing it as something you are. This shift is subtle but destructive, because once your identity fuses with the condition, every failure feels like confirmation, and every success feels like an exception. You need to break that fusion. Right now, whether you admit it or not, you likely carry a set of internal statements that define how you see yourself. These are not always explicit, but they show up in your thinking. Statements like, "I am not consistent," "I always mess things up," "I am behind everyone else," or "I am not capable of real change." These are not objective truths. They are accumulated conclusions based on past experiences, filtered through a negative bias. Your brain has taken selective evidence and turned it into a general identity. That process is flawed, but here is the important part. You cannot change your identity by simply telling yourself a different story. Affirmations without evidence do not work. Your brain rejects them because they do not match your experience. Identity change requires behavioral proof. You need to generate evidence that contradicts your current narrative. This is why the previous chapters focused heavily on action. Every time you follow through on a task, maintain a routine, or handle a situation differently, you are creating data. That data is what reshapes identity. But you need to consciously register it. Most people ignore their progress and focus only on their failures. This creates a distorted dataset. If you only record negative outcomes, your brain concludes that you are consistently ineffective. You need to correct this. At the end of each day, you should not only track what you did, but also what that says about you. If you completed your planned tasks, even partially, that is evidence that you can act despite resistance. If you faced a situation you would normally avoid, that is evidence that you are capable of exposure. If you regulated your emotions instead of reacting impulsively, that is evidence of control. These are not small things. These are direct contradictions to the identity you have been reinforcing. Now, let's address self-worth, because this is where things get complicated. Many people tie their self-worth to outcomes. If they succeed, they feel valuable. If they fail, they feel worthless. This is unstable. Outcomes are influenced by multiple variables, many of which are outside your control. If your self-worth depends on them, it will fluctuate constantly. You need to shift from outcome-based self-worth to process-based self-respect. This is a critical distinction. Self-worth is often treated as something you need to feel. That is not reliable. Self-respect is something you build through behavior. When you follow through on your commitments, even small ones, you build self-respect. When you act in alignment with your values, even when it is difficult, you build self-respect. This is more stable than waiting to feel good about yourself. Now, let's address comparison, because it is one of the most damaging habits in this context. You are likely comparing your current state to others who appear to be ahead of you. This comparison is flawed for several reasons. First, you are comparing different starting points. You do not have the same background, circumstances, or challenges. Second, you are comparing your internal experience to their external presentation. You see their results, not their process. Third, you are ignoring your own trajectory. If you were in a worse state before and are now slightly better, that is progress. But comparison blinds you to that. You need to shift your reference point. Instead of comparing yourself to others, compare yourself to your past state. Are you more structured than before? Are you slightly more consistent? Are you handling situations better, even marginally? This is the only comparison that matters. Now, let's address the concept of being behind. This idea is often vague but powerful. You feel like you are late in life, that others have progressed further, and that you have missed opportunities. This thinking is not useful. Life does not operate on a fixed timeline. There is no universal schedule that you are required to follow. What matters is your current direction. If you are moving forward, even slowly, you are not behind. If you are stuck and not acting, then the concept becomes relevant. So the focus should not be on where you are relative to others. It should be on whether you are progressing relative to yourself. Now, let's go deeper into internal narratives. Your mind constantly tells stories about who you are and what your future will look like. These stories are often automatic and based on past patterns. If you have struggled for a long time, your brain predicts that you will continue to struggle. This prediction feels like certainty, but it is not. It is a projection based on incomplete data. You need to challenge these narratives, not by denying them, but by testing them. If your mind says, "I cannot stay consistent," you test that by creating a system and following it for a period of time. If your mind says, "I always fail," you define what failure actually means and track your outcomes objectively. In many cases, you will find that the narrative is exaggerated. Even if there are elements of truth, they are not absolute. Now, let's address a hard truth. Some parts of your identity may need to be dismantled completely. If you have built an identity around being a victim of your circumstances, you need to examine that critically. Acknowledging that you have faced difficulties is valid. But defining yourself entirely by those difficulties limits your ability to change. You need to differentiate between what happened to you and who you are. They are not the same. Holding on to a victim identity may provide temporary justification, but it reduces your sense of agency. Recovery requires agency. You need to see yourself as someone who can influence their situation, even if you cannot control everything. Now, let's talk about values. If you do not define what matters to you, your actions will be inconsistent. Values provide direction. They answer the question, what kind of person do you want to be? Not in vague terms, but in specific behaviors. Do you value discipline? Then your behavior should reflect consistency. Do you value growth? Then your behavior should include learning and improvement. Do you value connection? Then your behavior should include engaging with others. Values are not just ideas. They are expressed through action. When your behavior aligns with your values, you experience a sense of coherence. This reduces internal conflict. When your behavior contradicts your values, you experience discomfort, often interpreted as low self-worth. So instead of trying to feel better about yourself, focus on acting in alignment with your values. That is more effective. Now, let's address the fear of reverting back. Even as you improve, there may be a persistent doubt that this change is temporary. This doubt is based on past experience. If you have tried to change before and failed, your brain expects the same outcome. You need to treat this as a probability issue, not a certainty. Your previous attempts may have failed because your approach was incomplete or inconsistent. If you are now using a more structured and comprehensive approach, the probability of success increases, but you still need to maintain it. Identity change is not a one-time event. It is reinforced continuously. If you stop the behaviors that support your new identity, the old patterns can return. This is not because you are inherently flawed. It is because habits and neural pathways remain unless consistently replaced. Finally, understand this. You are not trying to become a completely different person. You are trying to become a more functional, stable, and effective version of yourself. This is a refinement process. It requires removing distorted beliefs, building consistent behaviors, and aligning your actions with your values. It is not quick, it is not easy, but it is achievable. And the more evidence you generate through action, the more your identity will shift. Not because you forced it, but because you proved it. Chapter 6. If you try to recover in isolation, your progress will be limited, not impossible, but inefficient and unstable. Human beings are not designed to operate in complete psychological isolation. Your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are continuously shaped by your interactions with others, whether you are aware of it or not. This means your environment is not neutral. It either supports your recovery or works against it. Most people underestimate how much their social context influences their mental state. They focus on internal strategies, but ignore the external inputs that constantly reinforce their patterns. If you continue to stay in environments that promote negativity, inconsistency, or avoidance, you will struggle to maintain progress, no matter how disciplined you try to be. So you need to assess your environment honestly. Start with the people around you. There are generally 3 categories you need to identify: people who support your growth, people who are neutral, and people who actively or indirectly pull you backward. Supportive individuals are not necessarily those who always agree with you or comfort you. In fact, constant comfort without accountability can be harmful. Real support comes from people who encourage constructive behavior, respect your boundaries, and do not reinforce your avoidance patterns. Neutral individuals do not significantly affect your direction. They are part of your environment, but they do not play a major role in your development. The third category is the most important to analyze. These are individuals who reinforce negative habits, drain your energy, or normalize dysfunction. This does not always happen intentionally. Sometimes it is subtle. It can be through constant negativity, discouragement, unhealthy comparisons, or enabling avoidance. If you are serious about recovery, you cannot ignore this. You do not necessarily need to cut people off completely, but you need to adjust your level of engagement. Reduce exposure to influences that destabilize you. Increase exposure to influences that promote stability and growth. This is not about being harsh or arrogant. It is about being strategic. Now let's address isolation. Depression pushes you toward isolation. It convinces you that withdrawing is safer, easier, and more comfortable. In the short term, this may feel true. You avoid effort, judgment, and interaction. But in the long term, isolation amplifies depression. When you isolate, you reduce external feedback. Your thoughts become the primary input. If those thoughts are distorted, they go unchallenged. This creates an echo chamber. You also reduce opportunities for positive reinforcement. Social interaction, even minimal, provides stimulation, perspective, and sometimes support. So the solution is not complete withdrawal. It is controlled engagement. You do not need to become highly social. That is not the goal. The goal is to prevent complete isolation. Start with low-intensity interactions, short conversations, brief check-ins, or even being present in a shared space without deep engagement. This reduces the barrier. As your tolerance increases, you can gradually expand your social exposure. Now, let's address a common misconception. Many people think they need to feel confident or ready before engaging socially. This is incorrect. Confidence is built through repeated exposure, not before it. If you wait to feel ready, you will delay indefinitely. You need to engage despite discomfort. This is consistent with everything discussed so far. Action first, feeling later. Now let's talk about communication, because this is where many people struggle. When you are dealing with depression or anxiety, your communication patterns often change. You may become more withdrawn, less expressive, or more reactive. You need to be deliberate in how you communicate. First, be clear but controlled. You do not need to share everything with everyone. But you should not completely hide your state either, especially from people who are in a position to support you. You can communicate in simple terms. For example, instead of saying nothing, you might say that you are going through a difficult phase and working on stabilizing things. This sets expectations and reduces misunderstanding. Second, avoid over-explaining or seeking constant validation. It is important to share, but if you rely on others to constantly reassure you, you create dependency. This weakens your internal stability. Support should complement your efforts, not replace them. Now let's address boundaries. This is critical and often neglected. If you do not define boundaries, your environment will define them for you. Boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about controlling your level of exposure. For example, if certain conversations consistently increase your stress, you limit your involvement in them. If certain individuals push you toward behaviors you are trying to change, you reduce your interaction in those contexts. This requires clarity and consistency. You do not need to justify every boundary in detail. You need to enforce it. Now let's address the role of family, because in many cases this is a primary environment. Family dynamics can be complex. They may include expectations, cultural factors, and long-standing patterns. You may not be able to change the environment entirely, so the focus shifts to how you interact within it. You need to maintain your structure, even if others do not. You need to avoid being pulled into patterns that disrupt your progress. This may require difficult adjustments, such as saying no to certain demands or limiting involvement in unproductive conflicts. Now let's talk about support systems. There is a difference between passive and active support. Passive support is when people are available if needed, but not actively involved in your process. Active support involves accountability, encouragement, and sometimes challenge. For example, someone who checks in on your progress, encourages you to follow through on your plans, or calls out your avoidance patterns. This type of support is more effective. If possible, identify at least one person who can play this role. If that is not available in your immediate environment, you may need to look for structured support. This could be a mentor, a group, or a professional. Now we need to address professional help. There is a tendency to either over-rely on it or avoid it completely. Both extremes are problematic. Professional help, such as therapy, is a tool. It is not a replacement for your effort. A competent therapist helps you identify patterns, provides structured interventions, and guides you through processes that are difficult to manage alone. But if you expect therapy to fix everything without your active participation, you will not get results. On the other hand, avoiding professional help when you clearly need it is also a mistake. If your symptoms are severe, persistent, or worsening, you should not rely solely on self-management. This is not a matter of pride, it is a matter of effectiveness. Now let's address social comparison within relationships. Even within your social circle, you may compare your progress, achievements, or stability to others. This can create pressure and reduce motivation. You need to maintain focus on your own trajectory. Your process is different. Your timeline is different. Comparing them directly leads to inaccurate conclusions. Now let's talk about contribution. One of the most effective ways to shift your mental state is to contribute to something beyond yourself. Depression narrows your focus inward. You become preoccupied with your own thoughts and feelings. Contribution expands your focus outward. This does not mean doing something large or dramatic. It can be small. Helping someone with a task, sharing useful information, or being present for someone else. This creates a sense of purpose and reduces excessive self-focus. Now understand this clearly. You are not trying to build a perfect social life. You are trying to build an environment that supports your recovery. This means reducing negative influences, increasing constructive interactions, maintaining boundaries, and engaging consistently even when you do not feel like it. There will be discomfort, there will be resistance. But avoiding this area will limit your progress. Finally, understand the long-term implication. Your environment will either reinforce your new patterns or pull you back into old ones. If you build a system where your surroundings support your behavior, your recovery becomes more stable. If your environment constantly contradicts your efforts, you will need significantly more internal effort to maintain progress. So do not ignore this. Assess it, adjust it, and engage with it deliberately. Chapter 7. Most people focus on getting better. Very few focus on staying better. That is why relapse is common, not because recovery is impossible, but because it is not maintained correctly. You need to understand this clearly. The same patterns that led you into depression do not disappear automatically once you improve. They become less active, less dominant, but they remain in the background. If you remove the structure and discipline that stabilized you, those patterns can re-emerge. So the question is not just how to recover. The question is how to sustain recovery under changing conditions. The first mistake people make is assuming that feeling better means the work is done. It is not. Feeling better is a temporary state. Stability is a system. When your mood improves, your brain starts to relax its guard. You feel more confident, more capable, and less restricted. This is where people begin to reduce the behaviors that help them recover. They stop tracking their routines. They become inconsistent with sleep. They reduce physical activity. They reintroduce unstructured time. At first, nothing happens. Then gradually, small disruptions accumulate. Sleep becomes irregular. Thoughts become more negative. Avoidance increases slightly. And before you notice, you are drifting back into the same patterns. This is not sudden. It is gradual. Relapse does not happen overnight. It happens through small, repeated deviations. So you need to identify your baseline system and protect it. Your baseline system includes the core behaviors that stabilize you. These are not optional, even when you feel good. Consistent sleep, regular movement, structured daily activity, controlled exposure to your environment, basic emotional regulation. These are your non-negotiables. You can expand beyond them when you are stable, but you do not remove them. Now let's talk about early warning signs. If you want to prevent relapse, you need to detect it early. Most people only react when symptoms become severe. That is too late. You need to identify subtle changes. Are you starting to delay tasks more often? Is your sleep becoming inconsistent? Are you withdrawing slightly from interaction? Are your thoughts becoming more negative or repetitive? Are you losing interest in activities you recently re-engaged with? These are not random fluctuations. They are signals. You need to take them seriously. The moment you notice these patterns, you intervene, not aggressively, but deliberately. You return to your baseline system. You tighten your routine. You reduce unnecessary complexity. You focus on consistency. Think of it like maintenance, not repair. Now let's address a critical issue. When people notice early signs of relapse, they often react emotionally. They panic, thinking they are back at the beginning. This reaction makes things worse. You need to approach it analytically. A setback is not a full relapse. A few bad days do not erase your progress. Your response determines the outcome. If you interpret a setback as failure, you are more likely to disengage. If you interpret it as feedback, you adjust and continue. This requires control over your interpretation. Now let's talk about flexibility. A rigid system can break under pressure. A completely flexible system collapses into inconsistency. You need controlled flexibility. This means your core structure remains stable, but you can adjust around it when necessary. For example, if your schedule changes, you still maintain your key behaviors, but you adapt their timing or intensity. This prevents disruption. Now, let's address life stresses. No matter how well you stabilize yourself, life will introduce challenges. Loss, failure, uncertainty, and unexpected events will occur. You cannot eliminate these. What you can do is build resilience. Resilience is not about avoiding difficulty. It is about maintaining function under pressure. This is why your baseline system matters. When stress increases, you do not abandon your structure. You simplify it. You focus on essentials. You reduce non-critical tasks. You maintain stability. This prevents a complete breakdown. Now let's address the role of meaning. Short-term recovery is often driven by relief. You want to feel better, reduce discomfort, and regain control. But long-term stability requires something more. You need direction. If your life lacks direction, you will drift. And when you drift, old patterns can return. You need to define what you are moving toward. This does not have to be a grand purpose. It needs to be clear enough to guide your actions. What are you building? What are you improving? What matters enough for you to stay consistent even when you do not feel like it? This is where values become operational. They are not abstract ideas. They are criteria for decision-making. When you face a choice, you ask which option aligns with your values and long-term direction. This reduces impulsive decisions. Now, let's address complacency. As you improve, you may start to underestimate the importance of your system. You might think you can handle more, take on additional commitments, or relax your structure. This is where overconfidence can lead to instability. You need to scale gradually. Increase complexity only when your baseline is stable. Do not add multiple new variables at once. This reduces the risk of overload. Now let's talk about identity maintenance. In the previous chapter, you started shifting your identity through action. Now you need to maintain it. Identity is reinforced through consistency. If you stop acting in alignment with your new identity, the old one can regain influence. So you need to keep generating evidence. This does not mean constant effort at maximum intensity. It means consistent alignment. Now let's address the concept of relapse directly. Relapse is not a single event. It is a process. It usually follows a pattern. First, you reduce structure. Then, you increase avoidance. Then, your thoughts become more negative. Then, your mood declines. Then, your behavior deteriorates further. You need to interrupt this sequence early, at the first stage, not the last. Now let's talk about accountability. Self-regulation is important, but external accountability increases consistency. If you have someone who is aware of your system and can check in on your progress, you are more likely to maintain it. This does not mean dependency, it means support. Even simple accountability can make a difference. Now, let's address the fear of losing progress. This fear can create pressure. You might feel like you need to maintain a certain level of performance at all times. This is unrealistic. You need to allow for variation. Some days will be less productive. Some days will feel harder. This is normal. What matters is not perfection, but consistency over time. Now, understand this clearly. Recovery is not about eliminating all negative experiences. You will still have difficult thoughts. You will still experience low moods. The difference is in how you respond. You do not let these states dictate your behavior completely. You maintain your system. That is stability. Finally, let's bring this together. You need a system that includes clear baseline behaviors that you maintain consistently. Awareness of early warning signs. A structured response to setbacks. Controlled flexibility to adapt to changes. A sense of direction to guide your actions. And ongoing reinforcement of your identity through behavior. If you maintain this, your recovery becomes durable. Not because you never struggle, but because you know how to respond when you do. That is the difference between temporary improvement and long-term stability. Chapter 8. At some point, recovery stops being about escaping pain and starts becoming about building a life that is actually worth maintaining. If you miss this transition, you remain stuck in a defensive mode. You spend your energy trying not to fall back instead of moving forward. That is not sustainable long term. Avoiding misery is not the same as creating fulfillment. You need to shift your focus from symptom reduction to life construction. This is where many people fail quietly. They stabilize their mental state, but they never define what they are stabilizing it for. Without direction, stability turns into stagnation. And stagnation eventually breeds dissatisfaction, which can pull you back into the same cycle you worked hard to escape. So you need to answer a question that most people avoid because it requires clarity and responsibility. What are you actually trying to build with your life? Not in vague terms like success or happiness. Those are outcomes, not directions. You need something more concrete. Start with understanding that purpose is not something you discover in a moment of insight. It is something you construct over time through action and refinement. Waiting to find your purpose before acting is another form of avoidance. You act first, observe the results, and adjust. Now, let's break this down properly. There are 3 layers you need to consider: function, direction, and meaning. Function is your ability to operate daily. This is what you have been building so far: consistent sleep, structured routines, controlled behavior, and emotional regulation. Without function, nothing else works. Direction is where you are heading. It involves your goals, your work, your skills, and the path you are developing. This is where you start making decisions about what you want to invest your time and energy in. Meaning is why it matters. This is deeper. It connects your actions to something beyond immediate results. It gives you a reason to continue even when progress is slow or difficult. If you only have function, you survive. If you have function and direction, you progress. If you have all 3, you build something sustainable. Now let's address direction first, because it is more practical. You need to define areas of focus. These are not random. They should align with your capabilities, your environment, and your long-term opportunities. For example, your career or field of study is one major area. Your physical health is another. Your relationships form another. Personal development, skills, and contribution are additional areas. You do not need to optimize everything at once. That is unrealistic. You need to prioritize. Pick 1 or 2 areas where improvement will have the highest impact. Then, define specific targets within those areas. Not broad goals like be successful, but clear objectives. For example, improving your expertise in a specific domain, completing a defined project, or developing a skill that has measurable output. This brings structure to your direction. Now, let's address something important. You will not feel passionate at the start. This is a common misconception. People think they need to feel passion before committing to something. That is incorrect. Passion is often the result of engagement, not the cause of it. When you invest time and effort into something and start seeing progress, your interest increases. So do not wait for passion. Choose a direction based on logic and opportunity, then build engagement through action. Now, let's talk about meaning. Meaning is what sustains effort over time. Without it, you rely on short-term motivation, which is unstable. Meaning does not have to be dramatic or philosophical. It can be practical. It can come from responsibility, contribution, or the desire to improve your situation and the situation of others. For example, if your work contributes to solving a real problem, that creates meaning. If your efforts improve your family's stability, that creates meaning. If your actions align with values you respect, That creates meaning. The key is that your actions are not isolated. They connect to something larger than immediate comfort. Now, let's address a hard truth. If your life is structured only around comfort, you will become fragile. Comfort does not build resilience. Challenge does. This does not mean you seek unnecessary hardship. It means you do not avoid necessary difficulty. Growth requires friction. If you constantly choose the easiest option, your capacity does not increase. And when real challenges appear, you will struggle more. So you need to deliberately include challenge in your life, not extreme, but consistent. This could be through work, learning, physical activity, or taking on responsibilities that stretch your current ability. Now, let's connect this to your previous state. Depression likely reduced your engagement with life. You withdrew, avoided, and minimized effort. Recovery required you to re-engage at a basic level. Now you need to go beyond that. You need to build a system where engagement is not just a requirement, but a standard. This is where discipline becomes identity. You are no longer forcing yourself to act. Acting becomes part of who you are. But this transition only happens if you maintain consistency over time. Now, let's address the concept of fulfillment. Fulfillment is not constant happiness. It is a sense that your actions are aligned with your direction and values. You can feel tired, stressed, or challenged and still feel fulfilled. This is an important distinction. If you chase only positive emotions, you will avoid necessary effort. If you focus on alignment and progress, your emotional state becomes more stable. Now, let's talk about long-term thinking. When you are in a depressed state, your focus narrows to the present moment, often in a negative way. As you recover, you need to expand your time horizon. You need to think in terms of months and years, not just days. What you do today matters, but it matters more in the context of where it leads. This changes your decision-making. You start prioritizing actions that have long-term benefits over short-term comfort. This is not easy, but it is necessary. Now, let's address failure. As you start building something, you will encounter setbacks. Projects will not go as planned. Efforts will not always produce results. You will make mistakes. If you interpret these as personal failures, you will lose momentum. You need to treat them as data. What worked? What did not? What needs to be adjusted? This keeps you moving forward. Now, let's talk about consistency at a higher level. Earlier, consistency meant basic actions. Now, it means sustained effort in your chosen direction. This requires planning. You need to structure your time in a way that prioritizes your key areas. This does not mean rigid scheduling of every minute. It means ensuring that important tasks are not left to chance. Now, let's address distraction. As your capacity increases, so will the number of options available to you. Opportunities, information, and activities will compete for your attention. If you do not manage this, you will lose focus. You need to be selective. Not everything that is interesting is important. You need to filter based on your direction. Does this activity move you forward in your chosen path? If not, it should be limited. This is where discipline extends beyond action into decision-making. Now, let's address identity at this stage. You are no longer just someone recovering. You are someone building. This shift is important. If you keep identifying only as someone who is trying to avoid depression, your focus remains limited. You need to expand your identity to include your direction and your actions. You are a learner, a professional, a contributor, or whatever aligns with your path. This reinforces your behavior. Now, let's talk about balance. There is a risk here. As you become more focused, you might neglect other areas of your life. This creates imbalance, which can lead to burnout or instability. You need to maintain basic stability across key domains. Health, relationships, and personal well-being cannot be ignored. They support your primary direction. Now, let's address the role of rest. Rest is not avoidance. Rest is recovery. If you do not rest properly, your performance declines. But if you use rest as an excuse to avoid effort, you regress. You need to differentiate between the two. Rest should be intentional and limited. Avoidance is unstructured and prolonged. Now, let's bring this together. You started with managing your thoughts. Then you regulated your anxiety. Then you built behavioral structure. Then you processed emotions. Then you reshaped your identity. Then you adjusted your environment. Then you secured your stability. Now you are building a life. This is not a separate process. It is the continuation of everything you have done. Your actions remain structured. Your emotions remain regulated. Your identity remains aligned with your behavior, but your focus expands. You are no longer just fixing problems. You are creating something. Finally, understand this. There is no final state where everything is perfect. There is only a process that you maintain. Your life will continue to evolve. Challenges will appear. Your goals may change. But if you maintain the principles you have built, you will be able to adapt. That is the real outcome. Not a permanent state of happiness, but a stable, directed, and resilient way of living. And that is what allows you not just to recover, but to move beyond recovery. That is not the end. That is just the point where excuses stop being valid. If you are no longer overwhelmed every day, if you can function, if you can think with some clarity, then the responsibility shifts completely. At that stage, continuing to live in the same patterns is no longer something you can blame entirely on your condition. It becomes a choice. That might sound harsh, but it is necessary. Because if you keep treating yourself as permanently fragile, you will never step into a stronger version of yourself. And without that shift, everything you have built so far will slowly erode. This final stage is about consolidation. Not learning new ideas, but locking in what works and removing what does not. You need a system that you can follow even when you are not motivated, not inspired, and not emotionally stable. Because those days will come back. Not as intensely as before, but they will come. And if your system depends on how you feel, it will fail. So let's make this clear. You do not rise to the level of your intentions. You fall to the level of your systems. Your system needs to be simple, repeatable, and realistic. Now, break your life into 4 non-negotiable domains: physical stability, mental discipline, productive direction, and environmental control. If even one of these collapses for a prolonged period, your overall stability weakens. Start with physical stability. Your body is not separate from your mind. Stop treating it like it is. If your sleep is inconsistent, your mood will fluctuate. If your nutrition is poor, your energy and focus will decline. If you avoid physical activity, your stress will accumulate. These are not optional improvements. These are baseline requirements. You need a fixed sleep window. Not perfect, but consistent. You need to eat in a structured way. Not extreme diets, just stable intake. You need movement. It does not have to be complex. Walking, basic exercise, anything that increases your physical engagement. If you ignore this, everything else becomes harder. Now, mental discipline. Your thoughts will not suddenly become positive forever. That is unrealistic. Negative thoughts will still appear. The difference now is how you respond. Earlier, you were learning to observe and detach. Now you need to apply that consistently. You do not engage with every thought. You do not argue with every negative idea. You do not analyze every emotional fluctuation. You filter. You decide what deserves attention. This is control. If you lose this, your mind becomes noisy again, and that noise can pull you back. Now, productive direction. You need something that demands your effort. Not optional, not vague, but real. This could be your studies, your work, your research, or any meaningful project. You already know this from your own background. When you are engaged in something that requires precision and responsibility, your mind stabilizes. When you have too much unstructured time, your mind drifts. So reduce drift. Fill your time with structured, meaningful activity. Not busy work, real work. Work that has outcomes. Now, environmental control. Your surroundings shape your behavior more than your intentions. If your environment is chaotic, distracting, or negative, your discipline will constantly be tested. You need to reduce unnecessary friction. Keep your workspace clean. Limit exposure to content that triggers comparison, negativity, or distraction. Be selective with people. Not everyone deserves access to your time and energy. This is not arrogance. This is protection. Now, let's address something deeper. Relapse. It is possible. Not in the same way as before, but you can slip. Old patterns can reappear. Low periods can return. The mistake is thinking that relapse means failure. It does not. It means your system was either incomplete or not followed. That is it. You do not panic. You do not label yourself as back to zero. You analyze. Which part broke? Was it sleep? Was it isolation? Was it lack of structure? Was it emotional overload? You identify, adjust, and continue. This is how you maintain long-term stability. Now, let's talk about identity one last time. Earlier, you shifted from seeing yourself as broken to seeing yourself as someone capable of action. Now, you need to finalize that shift. You are not someone recovering from depression. You are someone who operates with discipline, awareness, and direction. Your past is relevant, but it is not your defining feature. If you keep holding onto that label, you will subconsciously act in ways that reinforce it. Drop it. Keep the lessons, not the identity. Now, let's address expectations. Life will not become easy. You will still face stress, uncertainty, and setbacks. But your capacity to handle them will be different. Earlier, small problems felt overwhelming. Now, larger problems become manageable. That is progress. Do not expect a life without difficulty. Expect a version of yourself that can handle difficulty. Now, let's address something uncomfortable. Comfort can become your next trap. After recovering, there is a tendency to protect your stability by avoiding anything that might disrupt it. This leads to stagnation. You need to take calculated risks, not reckless decisions, but steps that challenge you. Apply for opportunities. Take on responsibilities. Push your limits, because growth requires exposure to uncertainty. If you avoid it completely, your world becomes small again, and a small world leads to a fragile mind. Now, let's bring everything into a practical daily structure. You wake up at a consistent time. You engage your body early, even if it is minimal. You start your day with a defined task, not random activity. You limit unnecessary digital consumption. You focus on your primary work or study block. You take controlled breaks, not endless distractions. You maintain basic social interaction, even if limited. You end your day with reflection, not overthinking. This is not complicated. It is disciplined. And discipline is what creates stability. Now, let's address motivation. You will not feel motivated every day. If your system depends on motivation, it will collapse. You act regardless of how you feel. This is not extreme. This is necessary. Your feelings are data, not commands. You acknowledge them, but you do not obey them blindly. Now, let's talk about meaning again, but more directly. You need a reason to continue when things are not going well. For you, that might be your work in healthcare, your research, your contribution to people who lack access to proper diagnosis, or your responsibility toward your family. These are not abstract ideas. They are real, and they matter. When your actions connect to something real, your effort becomes more stable. Now, let's close this properly. You started this journey in a state where everything felt heavy, unclear, and overwhelming. You did not trust your thoughts. You did not trust your emotions. You probably did not trust yourself. Now you have structure. You have awareness. You have control over your actions. That does not make you perfect. It makes you capable. And capability is what matters. Because once you are capable, you can continue to improve. You are not trying to eliminate every negative experience. You are building the ability to handle them without collapsing. That is the real goal. So stop waiting for a moment where you feel completely ready, completely confident, or completely free from doubt. That moment does not come. You move forward anyway. You act anyway. You build anyway. And over time, that is what transforms your life. Not one big change, but consistent, controlled, and deliberate action repeated over a long period. That is the reality. And if you follow it, you do not just recover. You become someone who is difficult to break. That is the outcome. Not perfection, but resilience, direction, and control. And that is enough. Chapter 10. If you are expecting a final chapter that gives you a perfect ending, you are still thinking in the wrong framework. There is no clean finish line where everything is solved and you can relax permanently. That expectation is one of the reasons people relapse. They believe recovery is a destination, and when reality does not match that belief, they assume something is wrong again. Nothing is wrong. Your expectation is wrong. This chapter is not about inspiration. It is about calibration. You need to align your expectations with how life actually works, not how you wish it worked. You have already built awareness, discipline, structure, and direction. Now you need to maintain it without turning it into something fragile or obsessive. There are two ways people fail at this stage. The first is complacency. They think they are fixed, so they relax their systems. Sleep becomes inconsistent again. Structure weakens. Distractions increase. Slowly, the same instability starts creeping back, not suddenly, but gradually. And because it is gradual, they ignore it until it becomes a problem again. The second is overcorrection. They become rigid. Every routine must be perfect. Every habit must be followed exactly. Any deviation creates anxiety. This turns discipline into pressure, and pressure eventually leads to burnout. Both are mistakes. You need controlled flexibility. Your system should be strong enough to keep you stable, but flexible enough to adapt when life changes. Because it will change. Your workload will shift. Your environment will change. Your responsibilities will increase. Unexpected problems will appear. If your system cannot adapt, it will break. So instead of focusing on perfect routines, focus on core principles. Sleep consistency matters more than exact timing. Daily movement matters more than specific workouts. Focused work matters more than the exact schedule. Mental control matters more than perfect thoughts. If you maintain the principles, the structure can adjust without collapsing. Now let's address something people rarely talk about honestly. You will still have bad days. Not extreme like before, but noticeable. Days where your energy is low. Days where your mind feels slower. Days where you question your progress. If you interpret these days as regression, you will create unnecessary panic. A bad day is not a failed system. It is part of normal variation. What matters is your response. Do you stop everything and withdraw? Or do you reduce intensity but maintain direction? That is the difference between stability and relapse. On low days, you adjust your output, not your identity. You still act, but at a lower intensity. You still follow your system, but with flexibility. This prevents disruption. Now, let's go deeper. Your mind will try to negotiate with you again, not aggressively like before, but subtly. You will hear thoughts like, "You can skip today. You deserve a break. One time won't matter." Sometimes these are valid. Sometimes they are avoidance disguised as logic. You need to differentiate. If the break is planned and controlled, it is recovery. If it is impulsive and repeated, it is avoidance. Be honest with yourself. This is where self-awareness becomes critical. Now let's talk about comparison. As you improve, you will start noticing other people's progress. Some will be ahead of you. Some will seem more successful, more stable, more confident. If you start comparing constantly, you will destabilize your own progress. Because comparison shifts your focus from your direction to someone else's. Your path is based on your starting point, your constraints, and your goals. It is not identical to anyone else's, so use comparison only for information, not for judgment. Learn from others, but do not measure your worth against them. Now, let's address something more practical. Time. You need to respect it. Not in a vague sense, but in a measurable way. Track where your time goes. Not obsessively, but honestly. If you say you do not have time, but you spend hours on unstructured activity, then the issue is not time. It is prioritization. Your actions need to reflect your stated goals. If they do not, then your goals are not real priorities. This is where most people deceive themselves. They say they want change, but their behavior shows otherwise. Do not do that. Align your actions with your intentions. Now, let's talk about emotional resilience at a higher level. Earlier, resilience meant handling internal discomfort. Now it includes handling external pressure, deadlines, expectations, uncertainty, criticism, failure in real-world situations. You cannot avoid these. And if you try, your growth will stop. So you need to face them directly. Not recklessly, but deliberately. You take on responsibility. You accept that you will not always perform perfectly. You learn to recover quickly instead of avoiding exposure. This builds real confidence, not the kind that comes from feeling good, but the kind that comes from handling difficulty repeatedly. Now let's address relationships. During your difficult phase, you may have withdrawn or limited your interactions. Now you need to rebuild selectively. Not everyone needs to be in your life. Not every relationship is worth maintaining. You need people who are stable, realistic, and supportive of growth. Avoid people who normalize negativity, constant complaining, or lack of direction. This is not about judging others. It is about protecting your environment. At the same time, do not isolate yourself completely. Isolation increases the risk of overthinking and internal focus. You need balanced interaction. Enough to stay connected, not so much that you lose focus. Now, let's address purpose again, but more directly. You need to commit to something long-term, not because it is perfect, but because it is meaningful and practical. In your case, your field already gives you that opportunity. Your work in medical laboratory science, your research in tuberculosis, your exposure to real-world healthcare challenges. These are not abstract. They have impact. If you engage deeply with this, you will not need to search endlessly for meaning. You will build it through contribution. But only if you take it seriously. If you treat your work as just a task, it will feel empty. If you treat it as a responsibility with real consequences, it gains weight. That weight is not a burden. It is structure. Now let's address long-term maintenance. You do not need to constantly think about your mental state. That becomes another form of overthinking. You need periodic checks, not constant monitoring. Once a week, review. Are your systems intact? Is your behavior aligned? Is anything slipping? If yes, adjust early. Small corrections prevent large problems. Now, let's be clear about something. You are not immune to future difficulty. Life can still hit you hard. Loss, failure, unexpected events, these can affect anyone. The difference now is that you have tools, you have structure, you have awareness, so instead of collapsing, you adapt. This is the real outcome of everything you have done. Now, let's finish this properly. There is no final version of you, no point where you are complete. There is only a version that is improving or declining. Standing still is not neutral. It usually leads to decline, so you keep moving. Not aggressively, not obsessively, but consistently. You maintain your system. You adjust when necessary. You push when required. You rest when needed. You stay aware of your direction. That is it. No dramatic ending. No unrealistic promise. Just a clear, stable way to operate. If you follow it, your life becomes structured, resilient, and directed. If you ignore it, you will slowly drift back. That is the reality. And at this point, you already know which direction leads where. So the decision is not complicated. It is just a matter of whether you act accordingly. That is where everything depends. Chapter 11. By now, you have rebuilt most of the foundations of your life: routines, structure, emotional regulation, and direction. But there is one element that remains overlooked by almost everyone recovering from depression: mastery over your inner narrative. Most people focus on external systems, schedules, exercise, work, and diet, and underestimate the power of the story they tell themselves. Your thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations of events create the lens through which every experience passes. If that lens is distorted, it undermines all your efforts. The first step in mastering your inner narrative is awareness. You must observe the recurring patterns of thought that pull you into negativity. These are not always dramatic or obvious. They are subtle and insidious. A tiny voice that says, "You are not enough, this will never work," or "you don't deserve better." These thoughts are not facts. They are conditioned reactions, often formed over years of repeated failure, trauma, or neglect. Recognizing them is the first step toward control. Awareness alone, however, is insufficient. You must also intervene. This does not mean arguing with every negative thought. Doing so is exhausting and ineffective. It means shifting the narrative gradually, consistently, and deliberately. You replace the automatic, destructive interpretations with more functional ones. When a negative thought arises, you examine it objectively. Is this thought true? Does it help me move forward? Is it aligned with my values and goals? The goal is not to lie to yourself. It is to disrupt habitual distortion and rewire how you process your experience. Next comes intentional reinforcement. Your brain is highly plastic. It adapts to repeated patterns. Repetition creates habit, and habit creates identity. Therefore, you need to feed your mind with repeated, intentional affirmations of your capability, resilience, and direction. These are not empty phrases like, "I am happy" or "I am successful." They are precise, action-based statements. I will complete my work today according to my plan. I will maintain my sleep schedule. I will respond thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. Over time, these statements are internalized, not as superficial motivation, but as operating principles that guide your behavior. Now let's address the role of adversity. Once you feel stable, you may believe that life will now be easier. It will not. Stability is not immunity. Challenges will continue to arrive, sometimes in unexpected or overwhelming forms. The difference now is in your response. You have trained yourself to observe, regulate, and act deliberately. When problems appear, your automatic reaction is no longer panic or withdrawal. It is analysis, adjustment, and measured action. This is resilience in practice. Another critical component is emotional granularity. Many people reduce depression to a single concept, feeling bad. But emotions are nuanced, and learning to distinguish them is essential for long-term mastery. Anger, sadness, fear, disappointment, and frustration are all signals. You must interpret them accurately and respond appropriately. Confusing emotions or reacting indiscriminately to every signal creates chaos. Learning to identify subtle emotional states allows you to calibrate your actions and decisions more effectively. Equally important is understanding the interplay between cognition and behavior. Thoughts influence actions, but actions also influence thoughts. This feedback loop can either reinforce depression or consolidate recovery. Early in your journey, you acted intentionally to interrupt negative loops. Now you need to strengthen positive loops. When you act in alignment with your goals, your thoughts begin to reflect confidence, capability, and purpose. This is not superficial optimism. It is empirical feedback from your own consistent actions. Next, consider environmental reinforcement. You have structured your immediate environment to support recovery, but now you need to extend it to your broader life. Your social circles, digital consumption, and physical spaces must all be aligned with your values and goals. Engage with people who challenge you constructively, provide support without enabling avoidance, and demonstrate behaviors you wish to emulate. Limit exposure to sources of chronic negativity, distractions, or comparison traps. Your surroundings should reinforce your intended behavior, not undermine it. Time management evolves at this stage. Early recovery focuses on establishing routine. Intermediate stages focus on prioritization and preventing relapse. Now, you need strategic allocation. Every hour is a resource. Where you invest it determines not just your mood, but the trajectory of your life. Unstructured time is no longer neutral. It can slowly erode your progress. Use deliberate blocks for work, learning, physical activity, reflection, and meaningful social engagement. Build habits that compound, not habits that merely fill time. Let's address identity once again. Earlier, you moved from "I am broken" to "I am capable of recovery." Now the transition is from "I am capable" to "I am builder, creator, and contributor." Identity shapes decisions more than willpower. If you see yourself as someone who recovers from difficulty, your choices will reflect limitation. If you see yourself as someone who acts, creates, and contributes, your choices will consistently reflect growth. Reinforce this identity through repeated action and reflection. Now, let's discuss reflection as a practice. Reflection is not rumination. Reflection is structured review. End your day with a few minutes assessing what went according to plan. What deviated? How did I respond to challenges? What can I adjust tomorrow? This habit prevents minor inefficiencies from accumulating into crises. It turns experience into data and allows you to refine your system continuously. Self-compassion is another critical factor. Many people in recovery are highly critical of themselves, which paradoxically undermines their progress. Self-compassion is not indulgence. It is clarity. It is treating yourself as an ally, not an adversary. When you fail or struggle, acknowledge it factually. Analyze the cause. Adjust. Then continue. This prevents emotional overreaction and preserves energy for action rather than guilt. Finally, purpose-driven action is your most powerful tool. Your goals, values, and contribution give direction to every choice. If your actions align with a meaningful purpose, motivation becomes more consistent, your mental resilience increases, and life gains depth beyond momentary feelings. Purpose is the anchor that stabilizes your mind when challenges arise, and the fuel that drives deliberate progress when routine becomes monotonous. At this stage, your daily life should reflect a system of self-mastery. Your thoughts are observed and guided. Your emotions are identified and managed. Your environment reinforces positive action. Your time is invested strategically. Your identity is aligned with your long-term direction. Your reflection provides feedback. Your purpose sustains motivation. This is not perfection. It is a framework for living that ensures growth, stability, and resilience. You will still experience negative thoughts, difficult days, and moments of doubt. But the difference now is that you are equipped to respond deliberately rather than react impulsively. You are no longer merely surviving. You are building a life that is resistant to collapse, adaptive to challenge, and capable of fulfillment. Mastering your inner narrative, combined with disciplined action and strategic living, completes the final layer of recovery. It ensures that you do not merely escape depression, but transcend it. Your life becomes a product of deliberate choices rather than default reactions. Your mind, body, and environment operate in alignment, creating a feedback loop of stability, capability, and progress. The ultimate truth is simple. Recovery is not a destination, but a continuous, deliberate, and structured process. The moment you relax vigilance completely is the moment instability begins to re-enter. But when you maintain awareness, act consistently, and structure your life around your values and goals, you create a self-reinforcing system. One that allows you not only to survive, but to thrive, even in the presence of challenges that would have once overwhelmed you. It is about becoming the strongest version of yourself. You have faced the darkest parts of your mind, rebuilt your habits, trained your thoughts, and taken control of your life step by step. Every small action you took, the disciplined mornings, the deliberate choices, the moments you didn't give in to fear, was a brick in the foundation of your future. Now you stand not as someone defined by depression, but as someone defined by resilience, purpose, and action. You are capable of facing life with awareness, navigating challenges with clarity, and creating the kind of life you once thought impossible. There will still be hard days, moments of doubt, and times when fear whispers, but you now have the tools to respond, not react. Your life from this moment forward is no longer determined by your struggles, but by your decisions. Every choice to act, to build, to learn, and to contribute strengthens the person you are becoming. You are not chasing happiness. You are creating a life that is meaningful, stable, and fulfilling. Remember this. Stability is maintained through consistent action, not fleeting motivation. Strength is built by meeting challenges, not avoiding them. And hope is not a feeling, it is a decision to continue, even when the path is hard. You have recovered, not just in mind or mood, but in identity. You are no longer a victim of circumstance. You are a creator of your future, and that is the greatest freedom anyone can achieve. This is your life. Own it. Build it. Live it fully. The end, but the beginning of everything that comes next.